Hi, everybody. We are here with RevOps Review again. And today we have Lisa Kelly, who's co-hosting with me, ex-TalkDesk, LogMeIn, nice in contact, RevOps guru. And then we also have Christina Liu, who is ex-Zendesk. Christina, can you give us a little bit about your background?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Christina Liu here. I am currently the Chief Accounting Officer at Confluent. It is a data in motion company. We went public mid last year. Prior to Confluent, I was the Chief Accounting Officer at Zendesk. Was there for close to 8 years, joined in the early days when the company was less than $100 million revenue run rate, and the next 7.5 or 8 years had been an amazing journey to grow the company to over $1 billion in revenue run rate, and 10x the size of employee base, and of course went through a lot of the different pricing and packaging changes, new product changes, upmarket, enterprise focused. And so looking forward to an interesting conversation today about RevOps.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I'm most excited about, Christina, is that she's just done this whole journey and has lots of wisdom to share with hyper growth startups that are starting the journey of sticking in their tools. And she brings this unique finance perspective to the RevOps side of the house in terms of the bridge between sales and finance. And I know that Lisa, in her background, has experienced this from the RevOps side of working with CFOs and all of the different considerations that you have to have, from sales to CS to finance to RevRec, and the different pieces and parts that really, really matter. And then if you don't get right early, might explode later. So to kick off the conversation, Christina, I wanted to start with a broad question, which is, what does finance really need to care about? Why do they need to care about sales tools and processes early in a company's growth?
That's such a broad question, Kate. Maybe 2 or 3 points I can think about. One is that when you're early, you're doing a lot of things for the first time. And without realizing it, you're setting the cadence of how you do things in the future. So, of course, the foundation is very important, whether that's tools or enablement or process. I think the first time you're doing a lot of the things as an early company, it's important to reflect on that and think about the scalability. And that's something that finance cares deeply about, because it plays into your cost structure when you become a bigger company. Commonly, once a company reaches product market fit, sales is the largest cost on your P&L. So of course, finance cares about sales efficiency, and the tools and process and everything that is there to support the sales process to operate at a high level of efficiency so that we can scale. And on the accounting side, having been the Chief Accounting Officer for a number of years, I of course cares really about the quoting process and the billing process, because that data directly feeds into the revenue process. Later on, I'm sure we're going to talk about the tools available out there. Regardless of how good your RevRec tools are, if you get dirty data from your upstream process, which I've experienced a lot, a lot of lessons learned, then your downstream RevRec tool is useless, or you end up spending a lot of manual effort to clean up the data and to build the unnatural processes to clean up the data from upstream. So from accounting and RevRec perspective, I care deeply about the quoting process and the tools that enable that.
Yeah, I would say there's been a lot of situations where I've come in and seen a lot of pain being given to the accounting team because of the tools that have been chosen in the beginning part of the sales process, like how the transactional pieces end up causing a ton of pain downstream. And we've had to fix a lot of that. So when you think about revenue recognition and what's important there, which tools do you think should come first in a rapidly growing organization to accommodate RevRec's needs?
Well, I think there are, like I said, a number of RevRec tools that are out there, and pros and cons between these different ones, depending on how much customization that you're willing to do and you want to do and you want to maintain. Excuse me. But going back to my earlier point of the quoting tool, sometimes, at least from my experience, it was an afterthought. I guess it was not really paid attention that it deserved in the early part, because when we're small, we're just trying to do whatever it takes to close the deals, and nobody really give a lot of thoughts on the process and also on the capability and the flexibility of the quoting tool. Going back to my earlier Zendesk days, it was very much product-led growth at the initial stage, and the very typical trial and buy experience using credit cards. I don't think any of us really spent a lot of time to think about in the future how much complexity we could build on top of that, especially once we started to go up market to work with some of the enterprise customers, and our own customer base grew as well. Even if we didn't want to target enterprise customers, some of our SMB customers started to grow and started to have specific needs, and that over the years put a lot of strain on the upstream tools, especially around quoting, and we ended up building a lot of the band-aid solutions, if you will, because there was always a trade-off between speed and scalability, and it wasn't really a choice. It was just all hands on deck, trying to get this done, trying to get that done. And over the years, before we realized that you kind of have this spaghetti web and cobbled together process, and a lot of these backdoor solutions to compensate for what the tool is not capable of doing. And all of that really became issues of revenue recognition in the later days. Even if we wanted to implement some new features in the revenue recognition tool, and also in the 606 adoption, trying to cut our data in a different way, we realized, that data is not available because of the upstream systems not being able to be flexible enough to cut data in the ways that we wanted, or link data, or it was just, there was a lot of the gaps in between the quoting process and tools, and also the revenue process and tools. So not answering your question
no, you are
clearly, but what I'm trying to say is that it's an ecosystem. It's not that you can build out one side of the house using this amazing tool without thinking about the interdependency of something else. It's just the ecosystem that you want to maintain, and you want to you want them to be able to scale with the growth of your company.
Yeah. To just jump in there, and it sounds like what you're saying as well, Christina, is that even if you start out with one sales motion, you have to have the pricing and packaging complexity to then accommodate future sales motions, be it direct sales or other ways in which you want to go to market, because that does have repercussions. So where you started may not be where you end, but you need to set up that foundation correctly.
Yeah, I think that the flexibility or that the future proof of your tools and your processes, it's important. When you're small, and every company start with one product, with one pricing model, and typically that's very easy to use and interact with customer, but from there, if you look at a lot of these successful SaaS companies, their trajectory, their journey, every one of them became more complex. You know, whether that's organic or through acquisitions, you know, and there's somewhere along the way, you will want to monetize, you know, certain things that perhaps you were giving out for free. So that becomes an add-on. And once you have enough of these add-ons, then naturally you think about how can we package it together, we bundle it and offer as one suite of service. And then, you know, there are also different pricing mechanisms. The company I'm part of today has this usage-based pricing, right, in addition to the, you know, per seat type of license. So that can be another nuanced. And then, of course, there are acquisitions. You're going to acquire new products to fit into your suite of offerings. And so all of them introduce layers of complexity that not that all of them you need to anticipate, but one thing for sure is you're going to become more complex as your company grows. And that increase of complexity is not even linear. You hit certain, you know, pivotal points. It's all of a sudden you feel like, wow, this is overwhelming, and what am I going to do with, you know, all of these systems I currently have to scale them at the same pace of the company. So you know, you want to think about how can you stay ahead of the curve rather than always playing catch up.
Yeah, and I love the quote, complexity is easy, simplicity is hard, right? Like when you're talking about building a business and finding a way to make sure everything connects and works well together, simplicity is a lot more difficult. So you tend to see these companies adopt more and more complexity as time goes on. And I worked with a company who shall remain nameless that had, you know, 5 quoting tools going into their revenue recognition world. And it can really cause a ton of pain, because when they had made an acquisition, they just left it as is rather than doing the work to make it a simpler experience for the whole company. So, if you had a time machine, or it could go back in time and teach yourself something that you know now, what is it that you wish you knew when you were rapidly growing at Zendesk that, you know, later caused problems that you could have fixed if you had a time machine?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would have told my earlier self to anticipate more of the future complexities, or at least when I evaluate tools to really think about the flexibility of the configurations or the changes that you can make to these tools. You may not know where the complexities will come from. But one thing you do know is you need enough flexibility and configurability within your tool so that in the, you know, whatever that future complexity becomes, then you can reconfigure your tool, or you can maybe cut your data in a different way. You can tag your data in a different way so that it can be reported and can be ingested by the downstream system and process according to the changes that you're going to make. So that flexibility, instead of that, you know, monolithic type of configuration, that's where we run into a lot of the issues. The monolithic, we didn't even realize, or we didn't ask enough questions about the upstream tools, how flexible they were. It fit our needs at that time when we had one product, one pricing model, and it worked. And then later on, when we started to build out more of the different offerings, we realized, oh, this thing is just a one block that you can't change it. You have to live with it. And then the way I lived with it was to keep adding manual processes and then adding, you know, calendar reminders for maybe co-terminations, or just all these gymnastics that the RevOps team, I'm sure Lisa, you know, have to do the manual workaround to, you know, get the customers what they want. But then the accounting revenue team suffers through all of these gymnastics the RevOps team do. Because some of these don't really reflect the terms of the agreement. So it becomes an accounting nightmare.
Yeah, I think that the ASC 606 caused a lot of people to kind of hit the brakes and start reevaluating what they actually had available to them. So now that that's settled in, I'd like to, if I had a time machine to go back before then. I just remember talking about revenue recognition when those rules came out, and had some very interesting conversations about, okay, well, we're going to rip and replace our quoting tool because this isn't going to work. And so that was a fun conversation. So it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I can relate to that. There were a lot of companies adopted new quoting tools as part of the 606 adoption. It's an interesting observation. A new revenue guidance, in order to comply for that, you need to rethink about your upstream process and what data it's available or not available. So I think that was the driver for a lot of the new quoting tools being implemented.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then you implement them and, you are dependent on how flexible they are, and then how flexible everything is going down the line to accommodate any pricing changes. And, kind of going back to sort of RevRec specifically, with that in mind, for an omni-channel organization, someone that has a product-led growth PLG motion, plus potentially direct sales motion, in your mind, what are some of the best RevRec tools out there? Or at least how should people be thinking about them when you're, maybe sub 100 million in revenue and you're scaling rapidly? How should you be approaching this and thinking about it when you're looking to shore up this part of finance?
Yeah, I think when you evaluate RevRec tools, one mistake that I made earlier was I was trying to look for the perfect tool that can solve for all of my edge cases. Now I'm off the view, it's the 20-80 rule. I I'll look at a tool, whether, I'll first look at, where the company is evolving towards, what is my current revenue model? What are the multiple, element arrangements that I need to account for? What are the typical sales motions, the rip and replace, the expansion, and the renewals? Just first of all, of course, understand your current sales motion, and also, anticipate in 2 or 3 years time. And of course, that is part of the LRP process in the company. What type of customers and market are we trying to tackle, and try to anticipate that future use cases. So with that in mind, I would look for a tool that solves not necessarily 100% of my use cases, but maybe 80% or 90% of my use cases. And then think about, there are other automation tools, maybe RPA or some other type of automation to solve for the edge cases. Because like I said earlier in my days, I made the mistake of, looking for the perfect tool and also customizing too much out of that tool, that eventually every customization became a burden for you to carry. When there are new features being released by the vendor of the tool, then you need to run that through all of the customizations. And if you have so many of them, that becomes such a burden, not necessarily justifying the cost or the benefit you're receiving from all of that customization. So I think that's what I would, how I would think about the RevRec tools. And there are multiple, options out there. There are independent RevRec tools, and there are also the ERP. All the ERP solutions have their own like embedded RevRec tools. There's the pros and cons of both, right? Do you go with the best of breed, but then building that interface, or do you go with more of the embedded tools within the ERP system to take advantage of the more natural integration and interfaces of that? Those are just kind of a few items to think about.
Do you lean one way or the other if you were talking to a high growth, 4x, 5x growth rate company, one way or the other? Or do you think it really depends on the use cases?
It depends on kind of, maybe the company's overall philosophy. Are they of the mind of best of breed? And are they willing to, invest in the IT organization or the engineering organization to keep up with that, which can definitely pay a huge dividend because you have control over your destiny versus, going to like, a big ERP with all of these different modules, but also running the risk these modules don't like, talk to each other so natively anyways, because some of them came through acquisition within those companies. So I'm more leaning towards the former, but there definitely is a cost of running the best of breed. You have to invest in making sure that you do have a good ecosystem and also continuously to monitor the scalability of all of them and the interface all of them. But if you do that right, it's a very powerful infrastructure.
Yeah. And you also talked about how quoting and billing influence RevRec so much. And it sounds like that's almost as important a decision as the RevRec tool itself. And I would say, what are the top considerations that you think about in looking at a quoting and a billing solution that would feed into the RevRec solution?
I think it's the flexibility, as I mentioned earlier. In my earlier days, we didn't necessarily think about that because we didn't anticipate all of the future complexities in our product offering and pricing and packaging, and that what we hit certain point that it became so difficult for sales to quote. Someone showed me, a regular salesperson had to click through, more than 10 screens to get a quote out, to the extent that the sales leaders started to ask for additional resource just to do the quote. And so, that definitely wasn't a good experience from your sales teams. You definitely don't want your sales team to spend, half of their day quoting. You want them to be selling. And also all of these, the reason why they had to go through all of these screens and also have a, manual workaround was because of the inflexibility of, this core of our quoting tool. And of course, all of that resulted in dirty data and, coming to the revenue tool where then my team spent a lot of time to undo some of these things that was done in order to get the quote right. And so it was like, a double-edged sword that we're wasting a lot of internal calories on things that really didn't need to be so hard.
And you feel like that dirty data was really a consequence of the quoting tool itself not being flexible enough for the sales rep or easy enough.
Yeah. Like, tier pricing or co-term and all of these, if your quoting tool cannot accommodate, then you end up just doing some weird things to manually overwrite. Yeah. But then the result, the pricing may be right for the customer, but then when the data comes to your RevRec system, you have to undo some of these things and do it the right way. So you end up doing double work.
Yeah, you see a lot of that manual data entry happening. If they do it outside the system, they have to. I've seen them breaking PDFs to try and make a quote look right, things like that. When the quoting tool couldn't make it happen. So, and that's when I would see the accounting team want to strangle my team. Because we'd be doing quotes outside the system on the last day of the quarter. But yeah, it can definitely create a ton of issues down the road.
So your perfect wish, and what I'm hearing is that I want a quoting tool that's flexible for tiered pricing, all of the different pricing use cases, and then maybe the edge cases as well, that then deliver you the data.
I want no override. I want the perfect data flow through the systems. No override, no gymnastics, just let the data flow naturally.
Yeah. I'm curious, this is just an off the cuff question, is if you have that as a finance, as the head of accounting, how much ROI do you get from either total cost of ownership or just head count if you just had clean data? I'm just curious.
That's a good question, how you quantify that. In every company, especially a publicly traded company, you have such a short window to close your your books, because then after that, then you get into, you know, the forecasting mode, to think about guidance, to think about your talk track to your investors, reporting to the board. And so, you know, an hour saved during a closed window, you know, converts to like so many more hours during, you know, the non-closed window. So I think, you know, when you're trying to close your revenue and then your team spend a day trying to scrap the data to undo some of these things, that is a very significant burden, you know, from my team. So I'm not sure I can put just a dollar amount or percent, but it is definitely significant.
I bet your team would be a lot happier not having to do it too.
That's exactly right. The employee satisfaction. No one wants their 8 hours of the day is just to undo some of these things that, you know, the RevOps team did to get the quote out.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So it sounds like put in quoting early helps minimize this, but put in the right quoting early. And then I would be curious, another question is for the company that's scared of quoting and is like, I'm just going to stay in a spreadsheet because quoting, you know, per your point, can produce dirty data if you don't have flexible quoting. What would you say to the company that's picked that alternative and if stuck in a spreadsheet, like from an accounting perspective?
I think spreadsheet it's always flexible, but does not scale. You know, when you have like 2 reps, maybe that works. When you have 20 or 200, how can you do your quoting in a spreadsheet? How do you implement this consistency? There's no control. Like if I put my accounting hat on, there's no control of your quoting process. Everyone can do everything because it's a spreadsheet. There's no systematic control or no drop down list. That people make mistakes. Everyone does. We're human. And so it always scares me when we have, you know, a process that is purely based on spreadsheets.
Yeah. I'll tell us a quick spreadsheet horror story for you. A company I was working with was using spreadsheets, and they closed a big deal, and they had left a 0 off the price of the licenses on part of the quote. Not on the whole thing, but on part of the quote. So they actually had to go back to the client and say, this was a mistake. Will you re-sign this new contract? But honestly, that customer could have refused and we would have had to honor that pricing. So that's exactly to your point, that could have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in and of itself. And it was one of the larger deals that we had done. So the lack of control is a huge issue when it comes to Excel spreadsheets.
It's also a reputational risk.
Oh,
you have to go back to your customer
and to go back and be like, yeah, we missed a 0 on our quote. Sorry.
Now they know you're on spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like that's a real pro move there, guys.
All right. One final question. And thank you so much for the input on this, Christina. How would you advise, you know, up and coming RevOps folks in up and coming companies to work with finance on these choices? How would you want to be engaged as the head of accounting, you know, and as a finance leader in working through this stuff? And how would you advise that process for a high growth company?
Yeah. I would say just try to understand the holistic process end to end. You know, it's especially when you're early, trying to map out the data flow from the initial customer engagement to the end of that cycle, which is probably the reporting, and then all the steps in between, trying to understand that holistic process and think of, you know, this quote to cash process as a holistic process rather than different silos and making, you know, siloed decisions. That definitely, it's not the right way to go about. You know, you know, at Zendesk and also at Confluent, later in the years, we've done these larger projects to revisit the holistic order to cash process to try to unpack some of these issues. And that was extremely difficult because you have all these different stakeholders. You have sales being part of it, you have RevOps, you have finance, you have IT, you have collections, and it's just it's really hard to pinpoint who owns what in that process. So it's like the finger pointing, oh, you're doing something wrong, you're doing something wrong. Nobody like it's not for lack of good intent. It was just how this process, originally started, and over the years complexity was added, and every function was scrambling, trying to get to the next sale, trying to support the new initiative. And after a few years, you accumulate this spaghetti web of things that later on becomes really difficult to unpack, to even clearly state what are the problems and who owns these. And so early on, I would definitely advise the teams who are involved in this process to take a broader perspective, to think about the holistic end-to-end process.
And I would also say that, with this new evolution of revenue operations, where you have these operations people that may have been sales ops or service ops or success ops or whatever, and now they're moving into these true revenue operations positions. I think one of the most valuable lessons in my world was when I sat down and understood revenue recognition and followed that dollar, right? From the time we spend it in marketing, that lead comes through, we close the deal. This is what happens. This is how a renewal happens, and really understanding that. I think it's an important lesson for revenue ops people should understand RevRec, is what I'll say. And I think it's important to where, both you reach across the aisle, I guess would be the right way to put that the revenue operations person needs to be able to look at things from the finance perspective, and finance needs to understand what the operations side is facing as well. So I think a good partnership, and that's why, I will say that the accounting portion of a business are on the top 10 of the people I reach out to when I work with a new company, because of the fact that oftentimes they are not put into the consideration for a new tool, and that needs to change.
Yeah.
So
I guess that will be my ending question then, Christina, is because it's so strung together at so many companies, I think you do have this revenue operations role emerging, but people define that wildly differently depending on the company. And in your perfect world, how would you define RevOps, and how would it be formed, and what would it cover?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Similar to what you said, I've seen it in different ways, and also even the reporting structure can be different, where the revenue operations team sits. Lisa, the best. I think just the SaaS companies, this high volume subscription type of business model give rise to the need of revenue operations. Mm-hmm. I'm not the best person to articulate how to best build the revenue operations role. I just know that role is really super important. It's the hinge between sales ops and core finance. Mm-hmm. It's the best gateway or gatekeeper, if you will, for any data that comes into finance, and is an important function where a lot of the reporting, not necessarily financial reporting, but operational reporting, efficiency reporting, a lot of that comes in and has a very critical role customer facing as well. So it's a function that it's really in the center of sales, finance, and the customer. Mm-hmm. And it's responsible for the operational efficiency and excellence in that very important gateway. So that's how I think about it, is this gatekeeper and gateway for the finance function.
I actually love that analogy. I think that's great. And on that note, Christina, thank you so much for your time today. This was really, really helpful, and we appreciate all of your thoughts. And we hope to have you back soon. You can talk about more accounting and more RevOps focus, not just RevRec. All right. Thank you so much.
Good luck.